damage on you.
You just don't turn it off!
It's over!
I'm gonna come full circle. I know the reasons you're here.
Curious to see how things might have changed back home.
Look at this fucking.
And you don't like yards.
And you don't like shit. I like your sister, Diaz.
She got a thing for retards.
Oi, boatman. Some shit about part of his flock going missing. I said to him, look, mate, that's what you get when you go trespassing into fucking Burma than any other place on the fucking planet.
Bullshit.
Millions, moron.
How do you think they pay for that shit?
Fucking generals, biggest junkies of all of them. It's noble, Lewis. You won't. Those people going there when I work. Come on, jump, jump! The quicker we get there, the quicker we get back. Devil. To do God's work. It's ironic, isn't it? Oh dear. You doing? Hey, why aren't you waiting with the boat?
5 minutes.
Or a white man on and some fucking thing. It's got explosives. Tombstone.
None.
Fantasy form primer.
Check it out.
Your call. The First Thing Rambo, released in 2008, asks us to notice is not simply that John Rambo has withdrawn from the world. It is that the film initially gives him the position of someone who believes he has already seen enough of it. He is physically present, capable, alert, and almost unnervingly prepared. Yet emotionally he keeps himself outside the conflicts that other people still believe can be changed. That distance becomes the audience's starting position as well. This is film perspective media, and here the important question is not whether Rambo can become violent again. The film makes his capacity for violence obvious long before it fully activates it. The more revealing issue is how the movie controls our access to his refusal. Sylvester Stallone plays Rambo as a man whose judgments arrive before his explanations. He does not need to narrate an elaborate philosophy because his posture, short responses, and resistance to involvement establish a worldview built from experience rather than optimism. That matters because the people approaching him operate from almost the opposite assumption. They see suffering and believe presence can become intervention. Rambo sees the same possibility through a much darker filter. His distance is therefore not presented merely as apathy. The film gives it the weight of knowledge, or at least the appearance of knowledge. He seems to understand dangers that others have not yet accepted, and that asymmetry immediately gives him a certain authority. But the movie also creates a problem around that authority. If Rambo knows more because he has survived more, does that automatically mean his interpretation deserves to dominate everyone else's? The opening portion of the film does not completely answer that. Instead, it positions us close enough to understand his skepticism while keeping enough separation to recognize how severe it has become. This is where Rambo establishes its most useful tension. John is not introduced as a conventional hero waiting eagerly for a mission. He is someone for whom withdrawal has become a form of self-protection and perhaps even a conclusion about humanity. The film initially lets that conclusion feel credible because we experience the surrounding situation largely through signs that support his caution. Threat is not abstract in this world. It already exists before Rambo decides whether he will enter it. The effect is subtle beneath the film's aggressive surface. Our sympathy begins with the man who does not want to participate, even though the genre strongly suggests that participation will eventually become unavoidable. That creates an unusual split between expectation and alignment. We know what kind of character Rambo has historically been, but this film initially asks us to encounter the cost of that identity before enjoying its return. And that distinction is important. If the movie immediately celebrated Rambo's reactivation, his violence would function only as familiarity restored. Instead, his reluctance creates moral and emotional resistance. Every step toward involvement therefore carries another question. Beneath the action, is he recovering a necessary part of himself, or being pulled back toward the very condition from which he has tried to escape? The film will not keep us in this first position. Its viewpoint will move as certainty, danger, responsibility, and power change hands. But before those shifts arrive, Rambo gives us a man who believes distance is clarity and invites us to stand beside him long enough for that belief to become uncomfortable. The central contrast in Rambo is not simply between pacifism and violence. That would make the film easier to categorize than it actually is. Its more interesting division is between two competing ways of understanding responsibility. One position assumes that witnessing suffering creates an obligation to intervene, while the other assumes that experience teaches you exactly how limited intervention can be. John Rambo begins on the second side of that divide. His skepticism is not theoretical. The film presents it as something accumulated. He has lived long enough with violence to distrust the idea that courage, good intentions, or moral certainty automatically produce good outcomes. When other characters approach danger through conviction, he approaches it through prediction. He is constantly imagining consequences before they happen. That difference establishes the perspective axis of the film. The withdrawn outsider who refuses involvement versus the hardened participant who believes violence may become the only language a situation will answer. What makes that axis effective is that Rambo occupies both positions over the course of the movie. The apparent contradiction is the point. He wants to remain outside because he understands what participation demands, Yet the same knowledge that encourages withdrawal also makes him unusually capable once withdrawal becomes impossible. The audience is therefore asked to navigate two different kinds of authority. One comes from moral conviction. People who choose to enter a dangerous situation believe that refusing to act can itself become a moral failure. Their viewpoint depends on the possibility that individual action still matters. Rambo's authority comes from experience. He distrusts hope because he has seen situations in which hope offered no protection at all. The film initially gives considerable weight to his position. We are encouraged to recognize dangers that more optimistic characters may underestimate. That does not necessarily mean the movie proves every part of Rambo's worldview correct. It means his experience determines how threat is interpreted. When he looks at a situation, the movie often allows his caution to feel less like pessimism and more like recognition. This creates the episode's perspective thesis. Rambo keeps its central character emotionally distant while gradually removing the audience's ability to remain equally detached. The film's major movement is therefore not simply John Rambo deciding to fight again. It is the narrowing of the distance between observer and participant. That narrowing changes how we interpret his silence. At first, his emotional reserve can resemble disengagement. He appears to have reduced his relationship with the world to survival, routine, and controlled contact. But the more the film pressures that position, the more his detachment begins to look unstable. Refusing involvement may protect him from responsibility, yet it cannot entirely remove his awareness of what happens beyond that protective boundary. The audience experiences a similar instability. The film does not place us in a neutral position and allow us to judge everyone equally from above. It structures sympathy around unequal knowledge. Rambo recognizes certain risks earlier than others, so when those risks become more visible, his warnings gain retrospective authority. We begin reconsidering his resistance not as simple coldness, but as the behavior of someone who understands the price of entering. Yet there is a dangerous possibility inside that alignment. If the film makes Rambo correct too often, experience can become indistinguishable from moral superiority. His ability to anticipate violence could make every alternative viewpoint appear naive. The movie reinterprets that simplification, and later sections will have to examine where its perspective becomes narrow because of it. For now, what matters is that Rambo is not only the central character, he is also the film's strongest interpretive filter. His expectations influence how danger feels before he takes control of events. His distance shapes our distance. His suspicion teaches us what to notice. The shift begins when observation can no longer remain morally separate from consequence. Once the possibility of staying outside starts collapsing, the meaning of Rambo's competence changes. Skills that initially belonged to a life he appears to have rejected become relevant again, and the film quietly changes the audience's relationship with them. We are no longer simply looking at a man trying to avoid becoming who he once was. We are being positioned to consider why that identity still exists beneath the withdrawal and why the surrounding world may reward precisely the qualities he has spent years trying to contain. That is the uncomfortable foundation beneath Rambo. Intervention and withdrawal are not presented as clean moral opposites. Each contains its own failure. Distance can become abandonment. Action can reproduce the violence it claims to resist. The film's perspective becomes most revealing in the space between those two possibilities. At the beginning of Rambo, John Rambo may be the title character, but the film does not immediately give him complete ownership of the world around him. Instead, it creates an interesting imbalance. He dominates attention whenever he appears, yet he behaves like someone who has deliberately surrendered authority over other people's decisions. The film keeps returning to him not because he wants to lead, but because everyone else eventually has to measure their confidence against what he already understands. His physical position reinforces that distance. Rambo is living in Thailand, making a modest existence away from the institutions, military structures, and national identity that once defined him. The setting matters because it removes him from the familiar image of the decorated American soldier. He is not introduced inside a command center or surrounded by people waiting for instructions. He exists at the edge of other people's missions. That makes his first encounters with the Christian aid workers especially important. They arrive with purpose. Their language, behavior, and determination create the impression that they already understand why they are there. Rambo initially occupies the opposite role. He is the man being asked for transportation, local knowledge, and practical access rather than moral leadership. On the surface, that arrangement gives the visitors control. They have chosen the destination. They believe in the value of their mission. They define what helping means before Rambo becomes involved. But the film quietly shifts authority toward him through the way information is distributed. Rambo knows the territory differently. He responds not to ideals but to consequences. When danger is discussed, his reactions suggest that he is evaluating conditions the others cannot fully read. The film does not need to turn him into an all-knowing guide. His authority comes from comparative experience. He understands enough to recognize that the group's intentions do not necessarily determine what the environment will allow. That distinction changes who really owns the frame. Whenever the aid workers explain what they hope to accomplish, the film allows their conviction to remain sincere. They are not presented merely as foolish people waiting to be disproved. Their moral certainty has emotional force. Yet Rambo is often positioned as the person whose silence complicates that certainty. He does not need to defeat their argument verbally. His refusal creates friction because the audience has already been encouraged to treat his caution as informed. The result is a struggle between declared authority and cinematic authority. The missionaries can explain their purpose, but Rambo increasingly controls how dangerous that purpose feels. His presence changes the meaning of their confidence because the camera and editing repeatedly return to his assessment of what they are saying. A reaction from him can carry more weight than a longer explanation from someone else. Sylvester Stallone's performance is essential here. He does not play these early exchanges as debates. Rambo urgently wants to win. The character often seems to have moved beyond the need to convince people. That restraint gives him a peculiar dominance. Someone arguing loudly is still participating in the social exchange. Rambo often appears to stand outside it, as if the consequences will make the argument eventually unnecessary. The movie therefore centers him without making him socially central. Other characters may speak more. They may possess clearer immediate goals. They may initiate the journey, but Rambo's perception becomes the standard against which their assumptions are tested. This is also why Sarah Miller occupies an important position in the opening structure. Her interaction with Rambo creates a different kind of access than simple confrontation. Rather than treating him only as an obstacle, she engages the human being beneath the resistance. That does not suddenly expose Rambo's interior life, but it slightly reduces the distance the film has established around him. For a character this guarded, even a small change in relational position matters. Rambo is accustomed to evaluating situations through survival. Sarah's presence introduces another form of pressure. The possibility that refusing involvement is also a choice with consequences. She does not replace his worldview, and the film does not immediately declare her superior. What she does is force his distance to become visible. Before this contact, withdrawal can appear almost neutral. He has removed himself from conflict, and the world continues without him. Once another person directly asks him to participate, withdrawal becomes an active decision. That is the first reason ownership of the film's perspective cannot be reduced to screen time. Rambo owns the frame because other viewpoints increasingly acquire meaning in relation to his. Optimism looks different when placed beside his experience. Courage looks different when he interprets it as insufficient preparation. Moral commitment looks different when the person listening has spent much of his life watching commitment collide with brutality. Yet, the movie also creates a limitation by giving him so much interpretive weight. If Rambo is always the person who understands danger best, the supporting characters risk becoming instruments designed to validate him. Their viewpoints can shrink into contrasts, rather than remaining fully independent ways of seeing the situation. The early sections of the film mostly avoid collapsing them completely, because their willingness to act exposes something Rambo's worldview cannot comfortably answer. He may understand violence better than they do. They understand something about obligation that he is trying not to confront. That difference is more meaningful than simply saying one side is realistic and the other naive. Rambo's knowledge gives him authority over danger, but it does not automatically give him authority over the decision to care. This is where the film's framing becomes psychologically useful. John Rambo is visually and dramatically central, yet emotionally he remains partially outside his own story. Other people carry the intention to move forward. They bring the request. They create the immediate objective. They force movement into a life organized around avoiding it. So although the title belongs to Rambo, the opening perspective is shared unequally. The aid workers supply the reason to cross the boundary. Rambo supplies the film's understanding of what crossing that boundary may cost. And once those two positions occupy the same journey, ownership of the flame begins to change from a question of who leads the mission into a question of whose interpretation of the world the audience is being trained to trust. One of the most important choices in Rambo is that the audience never possesses much more strategic understanding than John Rambo does. The film does not build tension by giving us a privileged map of every danger and then waiting for the characters to discover it. Instead, knowledge arrives unevenly. We understand enough to recognize that the situation is unstable, but much of the film's force comes from watching different characters operate with radically different assumptions about what that instability means. Rambo begins with the advantage of experience. He does not know every specific event that will occur, and the film never needs to make him prophetic. What he possesses is a framework for reading risk. Certain signs that other characters interpret as obstacles or unfortunate conditions are, to him, evidence that the entire situation can turn rapidly beyond their control. This creates an important separation between information and interpretation. The aid workers are not entirely uninformed. They know they are entering a dangerous region. Their decision is not based on believing the world is harmless. What they lack is Rambo's way of assigning weight to what they know. The same information produces different conclusions depending on who receives it. That difference allows the film to create tension without making one group completely ignorant. Rambo sees warning where others still see possibility. The others see responsibility where Rambo sees a trap. For the audience, this means knowledge is filtered through competing forms of confidence. We hear the mission's humanitarian reasoning, but we also watch Rambo respond to it with resistance. Because the film has already established his familiarity with violence, his reactions quietly influence how we interpret what is being proposed. We may not know exactly what will happen, but we are encouraged to suspect that his caution has a foundation. This is where the movie's information structure begins shaping sympathy. If the audience knew nothing about the danger, Rambo's refusal might seem unnecessarily harsh. If we knew every threat in advance, the aid workers might seem absurdly irresponsible. The film instead places us in an intermediate position. We know enough to understand Rambo, but not enough to dismiss everyone who disagrees with him. That balance becomes harder to maintain once the film exposes the brutality operating beyond his isolated life. The conflict in Burma is not treated as a distant abstraction that exists only because the characters discuss it. The film gives the audience direct evidence of cruelty and vulnerability before Rambo has personally committed himself to changing anything. This is a major shift in information access because it breaks the protective boundary created by his point of view. We are allowed to see suffering that he can initially avoid seeing directly. The effect is significant. Rambo may still choose distance, but the audience cannot claim the same degree of distance once the film has shown what that choice leaves outside his immediate world. Our knowledge therefore begins to exceed his lived involvement, even if it does not exceed his understanding of human violence. This distinction prevents his withdrawal from remaining completely comfortable. He may be right about the danger. He may also be using that correctness to justify disengagement. The film does not have to state either conclusion explicitly. It creates them through access. By showing the audience circumstances beyond Rambo's immediate presence, it gives us material against which to measure his refusal. At the same time, the movie is careful not to give us deep interior access to the people responsible for the violence. We observe their actions largely from the outside. Their motives are not explored with the same psychological patience granted to Rambo. That choice makes the moral landscape clearer, but it also narrows the film's perspective. Threat becomes something encountered rather than understood. For an action film that has an obvious dramatic function, The audience does not need extensive identification with every force opposing the protagonist. But for a perspective analysis, the imbalance matters because it tells us where complexity is permitted and where it is withheld. Rambo receives ambiguity. The aid workers receive limited but meaningful moral intention. The perpetrators of violence are largely presented to what they do and the fear they create. This distribution of interiority shapes the audience's moral position before the central rescue effort fully develops. Once the missionaries disappear into circumstances Rambo warned about, another reordering of information occurs. The question is no longer whether the journey was dangerous. That uncertainty has collapsed. What matters now is who possesses enough knowledge to respond. Rambo's earlier caution gains new authority. But notice what has happened to the meaning of that authority. At first, his knowledge supported refusal. He understood danger, therefore he wanted no part of it. Now the same knowledge begins producing the opposite expectation. Because he understands the danger, he becomes one of the people most capable of doing something about it. The film has not changed what Rambo knows. It has changed what the audience believes that knowledge obligates him to do. This is one of the more effective perspective shifts in the movie because it grows from information that was already present. Rambo's competence does not suddenly appear. His skepticism does not suddenly become irrelevant. Instead, qualities that justified his distance are recontextualized as reasons he may no longer be able to remain distant. Knowledge becomes responsibility, not automatically and not comfortably, but increasingly. The audience also begins distinguishing between what Rambo knows about the world and what he knows about himself. His certainty about violence is far stronger than his willingness to articulate what returning to violence means personally. The film keeps his internal experience partially withheld. We can observe reluctance, anger, control, and recognition, but we are not given a detailed verbal explanation of every emotional transition. That withholding is crucial. If Rambo constantly explained himself, the film would reduce our relationship with him to information delivery. Instead, his interiority remains incomplete. We have to interpret him through behavior, reaction, and choice. The audience knows what he can do long before we know what accepting that ability means to him. This asymmetry gives the character weight. We understand his function before we fully understand his acceptance of that function. And as the story moves toward more direct intervention, the film gradually removes the uncertainty surrounding external danger while preserving uncertainty around Rambo himself. The world becomes easier to read at precisely the moment the protagonist becomes more difficult to reduce to a single position. That is the key informational movement of this stage of Rambo. The movie begins by letting John possess the clearest understanding of danger. Then it shows the audience enough to confirm much of his caution. But confirmation does not end the argument, it changes it. Once we know that Rambo was right about the threat, the more difficult question becomes what he is supposed to do with being right. The first major shift in Rambo happens when John's distance stops functioning as a stable position. Until this point, he has been able to treat involvement as something other people choose. He can warn them, refuse them, help only within limits, and still maintain the belief that their consequences belong primarily to them. Once the humanitarian group is captured, that separation becomes much harder to sustain. What changes is not Rambo's understanding of danger. He already understood that. The shift occurs in the meaning attached to his knowledge. Earlier, experience justified retreat. Now experience creates responsibility. This is why his eventual movement toward the rescue is more significant than the simple return of an action hero. The audience has been prepared to see Rambo as someone whose instincts were validated. His warnings were not paranoia. His assessment of the environment was not exaggerated caution. The circumstances have confirmed much of what he feared. A simpler film could use that confirmation as a moment of triumph. Rambo was right, and everyone else was wrong. But that would leave him exactly where he started. Instead, being right becomes uncomfortable because it places him in a unique position. He understands what has happened. He understands the kind of danger involved, and he possesses abilities that most people around him do not. The question attached to his competence, therefore, changes. It is no longer merely whether he can survive this world. It becomes whether possessing the capacity to act creates an obligation to use it. The arrival of the mercenary team makes that shift especially visible. They represent organized action without sharing Rambo's emotional relationship to the situation. They have a task, a professional identity, and a defined objective. Their presence might seem to remove the need for Rambo's involvement. Someone else has arrived to do the dangerous work, yet the film does not let him become irrelevant. Instead, it places him beside people who are willing to enter danger but do not possess exactly the same understanding of the terrain or the same accumulated relationship with violence. This produces a new hierarchy of competence. Rambo is no longer being compared primarily with idealists. He is now being compared with armed professionals. That comparison matters because it changes how his silence reads. Earlier, silence communicated withdrawal. Now it increasingly communicates assessment. He watches, he evaluates. He recognizes problems without needing to establish dominance through constant argument. The film begins repositioning him from reluctant outsider toward an unacknowledged authority. This transition is strengthened by Stallone's physical performance. Rambo does not suddenly become socially expansive because he has chosen to help. His emotional reserve remains. The change occurs through direction rather than personality. He starts moving towards something instead of merely keeping everything away. That is a small behavioral distinction, but it fundamentally changes the audience's relationship with him. Before, his stillness protected him. Now his stillness suggests readiness. The film's formal language begins changing with him. Rambo's presence increasingly carries practical weight inside group situations. His observations matter, because the audience has already seen the consequences of underestimating the environment. Every time someone dismisses or challenges his judgment, the earlier structure of the movie follows him into the scene. We remember that he recognized danger before other people did. That memory gives him authority even when he is not formally in command. And this is where an earlier detail is reframed. Rambo's initial refusal to participate might have suggested that he had separated himself from his former identity. The first shift reveals something more complicated. He has not lost the ability to inhabit that identity. He has been controlling access to it. There is an enormous difference between incapacity and refusal. The movie has been showing us refusal. Once circumstances make refusal harder to defend, the qualities that seemed buried begin to organize his behavior again. Awareness becomes tactical attention. Detachment becomes concentration. Physical capability becomes relevant rather than merely implied. Yet the shift should not be mistaken for emotional healing. The film does not present involvement as a clean cure for Rambo's alienation. If anything, returning to action exposes how naturally he can enter a world he supposedly left behind. That ease is disturbing precisely because the film has spent time showing us his attempt to remain outside it. He does not have to learn how to become dangerous again. He only has to stop refusing to be dangerous. That changes the moral texture of his return. The audience is likely to experience increasing satisfaction as Rambo's competence becomes useful, because the movie belongs to an action tradition built around precisely that expectation. But the perspective established earlier prevents that satisfaction from being completely innocent. We have already been asked to see the psychological distance surrounding him. His capabilities are therefore not just entertaining attributes. They are connected to a history he has tried to contain. The movie now begins exploiting a tension between what the audience wants from Rambo and what Rambo initially seemed to want for himself. We expect activation. He wanted withdrawal. The story increasingly makes activation necessary. This creates one of the film's strongest alignments because our desire to see the familiar warrior re-emerge can coexist with an awareness that this return may confirm his bleakest beliefs. If violence becomes the only effective response available within the film's immediate circumstances, Rambo does not simply defeat an external threat. His worldview also receives reinforcement. The world is becoming more like the place he believes it to be. That is why Sarah and the captured group remain important even when they are physically separated from him. They are no longer simply people whose optimism contrasted with his skepticism. Their vulnerability changes the emotional meaning of his detachment. What once protected Rambo from another person's mission now risks becoming refusal in the face of consequences he understands better than almost anyone around him. The audience's alignment shifts accordingly. We are no longer primarily observing whether Rambo will protect his isolation. We are waiting to see what happens when isolation is no longer morally sufficient, and when he begins moving toward direct involvement. The movie reframes everything that came before. His caution remains valid. His pessimism remains understandable. His knowledge remains intact. But the purpose of those qualities has changed. The same experience that taught John Rambo to stay away is now the reason the film cannot comfortably allow him to do so. John Rambo is one of those characters whose presence can dominate a film even when the film refuses to explain him completely. In Rambo, that distance is not an accidental absence of characterization. It is part of the way the movie controls our relationship with him. We are allowed to understand what he notices and increasingly what he is willing to do, but his emotional interior remains much less available. Sylvester Stallone builds that separation through restraint. Rambo rarely behaves as though he needs another person to understand him. His face often registers judgment before speech arrives, and even when he responds, the words tend to close conversation rather than open his private life. The performance therefore gives us access through observation instead of confession. That distinction matters because an action film could easily make competence the character's entire personality. Here, competence is visible, but the person producing it is partially hidden. We see how quickly Rambo reads danger, how decisively he can react, and how physically prepared he remains. What we do not receive is a continuous explanation of what those abilities feel like from inside him. The audience is kept close to his perception while remaining at a distance from his emotions. This creates an unusual form of alignment. We often understand why Rambo distrusts a situation before we understand what that distrust has done to him psychologically. His behavior tells us that he has learned to expect violence, betrayal, or collapse. His reluctance to reconnect with conflict suggests that these expectations carry a personal cost. But the film does not transform that suggestion into a detailed psychological case history. Instead, Stallone uses posture and stillness to communicate a man who appears to conserve himself. Rambo frequently seems more comfortable watching than participating socially. His body can remain controlled while other people argue, explain, persuade, or assert authority. That control produces distance because emotional reaction is rarely offered in an expansive form. We have to notice small changes, a look held slightly longer, a shift from refusal to attention, the difference between passive silence and focused silence. The film becomes more effective whenever it trusts those differences. Sarah Miller is important partly because her interactions with Rambo create one of the few opportunities for that distance to soften without disappearing. She does not suddenly unlock him through a single conversation, and the film is stronger for avoiding that shortcut. Instead, her presence challenges the assumption that his withdrawal makes him unreachable. She approaches him as more than a useful operator. That matters because many of the other relationships around Rambo are defined by function. People need transportation, knowledge, protection, or combat ability. Sarah's interactions introduce a more human form of attention, one that recognizes the severity of his worldview without treating him only as a weapon. The audience responds to that shift because Rambo responds to it, however minimally. His emotional distance therefore becomes relational rather than absolute. He can be reached, but the film makes access difficult. This preserves ambiguity around his motivations when he later becomes more involved. We can recognize concern without reducing every decision to personal attachment. We can recognize responsibility without pretending that the film has suddenly transformed him into an idealist. That restraint is crucial. The version of Rambo presented here would become less convincing if the movie gave him a long verbal transformation from cynicism to hope. His experience has been established too strongly for that kind of conversion. The more credible movement is smaller. He does not necessarily begin believing the world is better than he thought. He begins accepting that his response to that world still matters. This is also why his relationship with the mercenaries produces a different kind of distance. Around Sarah and the aid workers, Rambo's separation is partly philosophical. Around armed professionals, it becomes a question of authority, competence, and recognition. These men understand danger in a way the missionaries do not, yet they do not automatically understand Rambo. Their skepticism toward him initially places the audience in an interesting position. We possess more contextual knowledge about Rambo than they do. We have watched his caution acquire credibility. We know that the quiet older man being assessed from the outside carries experience the group has not fully measured. For once, the film gives the audience privileged alignment with Rambo without giving us deeper access to his emotions. We know what others are underestimating. Rambo does not need to tell us. This makes his silence function almost like dramatic information. The less he argues for his own importance, the more the film invites us to notice the gap between how other characters see him and what we have already learned. Yet, the movie also risks making that distance too convenient. When a protagonist speaks very little and possesses extraordinary competence, silence can easily become a shortcut to depth. The audience may supply complexity that the screenplay has not actually developed. Rambo sometimes approaches that boundary. The character's history carries enormous weight, and the film benefits from what viewers already understand about him. But Stallone's performance gives the reserve enough specificity to prevent Rambo from becoming completely blank. There is fatigue in the way he occupies space. His alertness does not resemble excitement. Even as action becomes unavoidable, he rarely gives the impression that returning to violence is restoring some uncomplicated pleasure. His body becomes more purposeful. But emotional openness does not increase at the same rate. That gap is important. The more capable Rambo becomes externally, the less the film needs to tell us internally. Action begins replacing explanation. We learn what he has decided through movement, presence, and commitment. This can create empathy without intimacy. We may sympathize with Rambo because we understand the circumstances forcing him back toward a role he has tried to abandon. But sympathy does not mean complete identification. The film still keeps something closed. His accumulated experience has shaped a worldview that other characters can challenge but cannot easily enter. That unresolved distance protects the movie from turning him into a conventional inspirational figure. Rambo does not become admirable because he discovers a cheerful faith in humanity. His value within the story comes from something harsher. He recognizes how destructive people can be, understands the consequences of confronting that destruction, and eventually chooses involvement without pretending those consequences have disappeared. The audience is therefore drawn closer to his choices while remaining separated from part of the man making them. And that separation is what allows Rambo to retain ambiguity. His return can be read as responsibility. It can also be read as confirmation that violence remains the environment in which he understands himself most completely. The film does not need to resolve that tension yet. By keeping John Rambo emotionally at a distance, it makes his increasing physical involvement more revealing. Every step deeper into the conflict brings us closer to what he can do, while leaving open the more difficult question of what becoming that person again is doing to him. The dominant perspective of Rambo has a blind spot, and the film becomes more interesting once that limitation is visible. John Rambo is exceptionally good at recognizing immediate danger. He understands coercion, fear, force, and the speed with which a situation can collapse. But the worldview produced by that experience tends to reduce complex human situations to the question of whether violence is already present or about to become unavoidable. That gives him clarity. It also narrows what he can see. Rambo understands why idealism can fail under extreme conditions. But the film gives him far less language for understanding why people continue acting from idealism even after those conditions are acknowledged. From his position, moral commitment can resemble naivety because he evaluates choices primarily through consequences he already knows how to anticipate. The aid workers expose this limitation. They are not valuable merely because they prove Rambo correct about danger. Their existence presents a form of responsibility he has difficulty incorporating into his worldview. They enter a dangerous environment because remaining outside it would mean accepting suffering they believe they can reduce. Rambo sees the risk clearly, but risk is not the only variable shaping their decision. His blind spot is therefore not ignorance of reality. It is an incomplete definition of reality. He has become so accustomed to reading the world through survival that other motives can look secondary beside it. Compassion, faith, duty, solidarity, and voluntary vulnerability do not fit easily into a worldview built around recognizing what violence can do to people. The film never fully develops this contradiction, but it does make it visible. Sarah is especially important because she does not defeat Rambo's skepticism through superior knowledge. She cannot claim to understand the environment better than he does. Instead, she complicates the assumption that understanding danger should automatically produce withdrawal. Her position forces another possibility into the frame. A person can understand that involvement is dangerous and still believe involvement is necessary. That is different from failing to perceive danger. Rambo's tendency to treat those positions as nearly the same reveals the limit of his perspective. The same limitation appears in his relationship with the mercenary team, although in another form. Here, Rambo is no longer dealing with idealists who underestimate violent conditions. He is dealing with professionals whose competence should, in theory, place them closer to his own understanding, yet he remains separated from them. The difference suggests that Rambo's isolation is not caused only by other people lacking experience. Even among people who operate comfortably around danger, he occupies an unusually close position. His past has not simply taught him caution. It has damaged his ability to imagine belonging comfortably to any group. That matters because the movie sometimes frames Rambo's isolation as wisdom. Much of the evidence supports that framing. He reads threats effectively. He has little patience for false confidence. He recognizes how quickly control can disappear. But isolation can be both accurate and limiting. A person may correctly understand danger while incorrectly assuming that danger explains everything. The film becomes weaker whenever it allows Rambo's perception to swallow every competing viewpoint. If every idealist exists primarily to be collected, and every professional exists primarily to underestimate him, then the world becomes arranged around proving the protagonist's interpretation superior. That would make perspective indistinguishable from validation. The stronger moments resist that simplification. Sarah's moral commitment reveals something Rambo cannot derive from survival logic alone. The missionaries' vulnerability does not merely prove that they made a risky decision. It also makes their reason for entering that risk morally relevant. Their choices create consequences, but those consequences do not automatically erase the values behind the choices. This distinction is necessary because otherwise the film would unintentionally argue that avoiding danger is always more rational than confronting suffering. Rambo himself eventually contradicts that idea. His movement toward intervention demonstrates that his original philosophy cannot remain complete. He begins acting according to a principle. His earlier behavior resisted. Knowing that something is dangerous does not necessarily release you from responsibility. That is the clearest evidence that the blind spot belongs partly to the character rather than simply to the screenplay. Rambo changes because experience alone cannot answer the situation anymore. What he initially sees as other people's dangerous idealism eventually becomes connected to his own obligation to act. Yet another blind spot remains, and this one belongs more clearly to the film's structure. The people suffering inside the conflict are given far less subjective depth than Rambo himself. Their vulnerability establishes stakes, and their treatment communicates the severity of the environment. But the film generally does not grant them the same sustained interior access it grants its Central American character. We understand what their suffering means for Rambo's decision more fully than we understand their lives independently of him. This is not automatically a plot hole or a contradiction. It is a consequence of focalization. The story is organized around John Rambo's re-entry into violence, so other experiences are necessarily filtered through that central dramatic movement. But the limitation changes what the film can meaningfully claim. Its portrait of violence may feel immediate, yet its understanding of the people living permanently under that violence remains comparatively distant. The movie is much more confident describing what brutality awakens in Rambo than exploring the full social world being brutalized. Recognizing that limitation does not invalidate the film's perspective. It defines its boundaries. Rambo sees certain things with extraordinary clarity: fear, force, vulnerability, competence, and the difference between imagining danger and surviving it. What it sees less clearly are the forms of human value that cannot be reduced to survival. And that blind spot matters because Rambo's eventual return to action depends on one of those values breaking through the worldview he trusts most. Power in Rambo is rarely presented as something abstract. It is visible in who can move freely, who can command others, who can refuse an order, who is forced to obey, and who possesses enough knowledge or force to change what happens next. As the film moves deeper into the rescue mission, those differences begin controlling not only the characters' circumstances, but also the audience's judgment of them. John Rambo occupies a strange position inside this structure, because he possesses enormous practical power without initially possessing formal authority. The mercenary team has organization. They have leadership, weapons, a defined assignment, and an internal hierarchy. Rambo arrives without the same official status. He is not the person everyone has agreed to follow. From the group's perspective, he can initially appear like an unnecessary attachment to a professional operation. The audience sees him differently. By this point, the film has already shown that Rambo understands the environment in ways others repeatedly underestimate. We have watched caution become justified and silence become evidence of assessment rather than ignorance. That history creates an imbalance between social authority and cinematic authority. Inside the group, someone else may issue instructions. From the audience's position, Rambo increasingly looks like the person most capable of recognizing when those instructions no longer fit reality. That difference is crucial because Rambo repeatedly links power with the ability to define what counts as true. A confident order can temporarily establish one version of the situation. A reaction from Rambo can destabilize it. His experience becomes a competing source of authority, and the film encourages us to compare institutional confidence with practical awareness. The point is not that leadership is automatically foolish while individual instinct is automatically correct. The more interesting tension comes from watching legitimacy and competence separate. Someone can possess the right to command without possessing the clearest understanding. Someone else can understand the danger without being granted the right to define the group's response. Rambo exists inside that gap. This creates friction with the mercenaries because accepting his judgment would mean admitting that hierarchy alone does not determine expertise. The film uses the skepticism to make power relational. Rambo does not need a rank to threaten another person's authority. He only needs to demonstrate that his perception is harder to dismiss than his position suggests. His body also becomes part of that challenge. Stallone plays Rambo with very little interest in performative dominance. He does not constantly announce what he can do. Instead, physical control becomes a form of authority that precedes recognition. The audience understands that the character is dangerous before some of the people around him fully understand it. That gives us privileged knowledge. We are watching characters negotiate status while knowing that their hierarchy may not reflect their actual capacities. When circumstances become more severe, that imbalance becomes harder to maintain. The environment starts stripping formal power down to usefulness. Plants become vulnerable to conditions. Titles matter less when immediate survival depends on reading those conditions correctly. Rambo's authority grows because the situation increasingly rewards the kind of knowledge he possesses. This does not mean the film celebrates power in every form. Quite the opposite occurs when authority is examined on the other side of the conflict. The oppressive forces dominating vulnerable civilians represent power without meaningful moral restraint. Their control is demonstrated through fear, coercion, and the ability to decide what happens to people who cannot resist them. The film offers little psychological intimacy with those exercising that control. Instead, it defines them largely through the consequences of their authority. That choice positions the audience very clearly. We are not being asked to weigh two equally developed accounts of the conflict. We are shown an extreme imbalance between those who can impose conditions and those forced to endure them. The clarity serves the action structure, but it also reveals how the film distributes perspective. People with abusive power are observed externally. People suffering under that power are often seen through vulnerability. Rambo is granted the greatest interpretive depth because he becomes the figure capable of interrupting the imbalance. This creates a potentially uncomfortable relationship between moral authority and physical capacity. the aid workers entered believing that helping others could occur through service. The conflict demonstrates how fragile that form of influence becomes when confronted by people willing to enforce control violently. The mercenaries bring professional force, but their effectiveness depends on whether they understand the situation well enough to use it. Rambo represents another category. He combines force with experiential knowledge. That combination gradually makes his worldview dominant. The film therefore shifts our judgment of him again. His capacity for violence initially seemed like something dangerous he was trying to keep contained. Under the new power structure, the same capacity starts looking like one of the few available means of resisting people whose authority is already maintained through violence. This is where the film's moral alignment becomes much more aggressive. Earlier, we could ask whether Rambo's pessimism was too restrictive. Now the surrounding conditions seem designed to validate his belief that certain forms of power cannot be answered through goodwill alone. Yet that validation carries a cost. As the world of the film becomes organized so that Rambo's methods are always the only effective methods, then the perspective stops testing his worldview and begins confirming it. The distinction matters. A strong reframe should complicate the protagonist as circumstances change. A weaker one simply constructs circumstances where his assumptions cannot lose. Rambo moves between those possibilities. At its best, the film makes his growing authority feel earned because he recognizes danger, adapts to uncertainty, and acts when other forms of control fail. At its simplest, it reduces competing positions until violence becomes not merely necessary in the immediate situation, but almost synonymous with realism. The audience's position follows this transformation. We begin beside a man who has rejected power over others. We then watch circumstances give him increasing influence because his knowledge becomes indispensable. Eventually, the distinction between the reluctant outsider and the decisive participant becomes difficult to maintain. Rambo does not formally seize authority because he wants status. Authority moves toward him because the situation begins rewarding the person most capable of surviving it. And that changes how we see everyone around him. The mercenaries are no longer measured only by professional identity, but by whether they recognize useful knowledge when it appears outside their hierarchy. The aid workers are no longer measured only by intention, but by how vulnerable intention becomes without power. The civilians are positioned as people whose lack of control exposes the moral stakes of everyone else's decisions. And Rambo is increasingly measured by whether possessing extraordinary power creates an obligation to use it. The film's answer is becoming clearer. What remains less clear is whether using that power can ever leave John Rambo unchanged. The moral perspective of Rambo becomes more complicated once the film stops asking whether violence can be avoided and starts asking what happens when avoidance itself has consequences. By this stage, the audience has already been positioned to understand John Rambo's reluctance. We know that his skepticism comes from experience, not laziness. We also know that the people he initially resisted helping are now trapped inside circumstances where good intentions offer very little protection. That combination creates a dangerous kind of moral clarity. The more brutal the surrounding situation becomes, the easier it is for the film to make Rambo's methods feel justified. But justification and celebration are not the same thing. The strongest reading of the film depends on keeping those ideas separate. Rambo's capacity for violence is useful because the people exercising power against civilians have created conditions in which ordinary negotiation has almost no meaningful force. The film therefore invites the audience to accept actions that would appear indefensible in a different context. Moral judgment changes because context changes. This is one of the basic mechanisms of action cinema. The protagonist does not necessarily become morally different. The world around him becomes extreme enough that previously troubling abilities start looking necessary. In Rambo, this mechanism is especially important because John's violence has already been framed as something he has tried to leave behind. The movie is not introducing a new capacity. It is reclassifying an old one. At first, his violent past helps explain why he withdrew. Later, that same history helps explain why he can intervene effectively. The audience is therefore encouraged to reconsider something that initially looked like damage as something that can temporarily function as protection. That is a morally uncomfortable reframe. It would be easier if the film simply presented violence as heroic from the beginning. Then there would be no meaningful shift in our judgment. Instead, the story makes us spend time with Rambo's refusal before placing him in circumstances where refusal becomes increasingly difficult to defend. The moral lens moves with that pressure. We begin by respecting his right to stay outside. We move toward expecting him to enter. Eventually, the film makes his participation feel almost inevitable. But inevitability is precisely where the movie deserves scrutiny. When a story creates a world in which one form of action repeatedly becomes the only effective response, it can appear to be discovering moral necessity when it has actually constructed it. That does not make the conflict meaningless. It simply means we should distinguish between what the characters face and what the screenplay chooses to make available to them. Inside the immediate circumstances, Rambo's choices can appear defensible because the threat is severe and alternatives are extremely limited. At the structural level, however, the movie has designed the circumstances to align effectiveness with the protagonist's most dangerous abilities. The result is a powerful but narrow moral framework. Rambo is valuable because he can do what other people cannot. The danger is that capability begins to look like righteousness. The film occasionally resists that equation through Rambo himself. He does not behave like someone discovering moral purity through combat. His return to violence is not accompanied by a sudden claim that everything he does is noble. He remains severe, emotionally contained, and shaped by a worldview that was pessimistic long before the current conflict. That performance prevents the character from becoming a simple fantasy of purification. He can be necessary without being uncomplicated. This distinction is essential to the film's moral perspective. The audience is not required to believe that violence has healed Rambo. We are asked to believe that he has entered a situation where his familiarity with violence has become useful. Those are very different claims. The aid workers complicate the film from another direction. Their mission is based on moral principles that do not depend on overwhelming physical power. They believe care, assistance, and presence have value even when those things cannot guarantee safety. Their vulnerability does not automatically invalidate those values. If the movie treated their suffering only as proof that compassion is foolish, its moral perspective would become extremely shallow. Instead, their choices reveal something Rambo's original worldview lacks. They believe there are situations where accepting personal danger can be preferable to comfortable distance. Eventually, Rambo acts according to a related principle even though his methods are completely different. That connection matters. The idealists and the warrior appear to occupy opposite moral positions, but their actions begin converging around responsibility. The missionaries accept danger because they believe suffering demands involvement. Rambo accepts danger because his capacity to intervene makes continued withdrawal increasingly intolerable. Their philosophies remain different, yet the gap between them becomes smaller than it first appeared. This is one of the film's more interesting moral reversals. Rambo does not become like them, but he begins doing something his earlier perspective rejected. He allows another person's vulnerability to create an obligation. The difference is that once he accepts that obligation, he responds through the skills and assumptions he knows best. That is where the film's moral lens becomes most unstable. Compassion may be the reason he enters. Violence becomes the mechanism through which he can act. The audience is then asked to judge the mechanism through the urgency of the reason. This can create enormous emotional permission. When vulnerable people are threatened and the opposing force is presented with little ambiguity, the audience is encouraged to want decisive resistance. The more severe the imbalance becomes, the less patience we are likely to have for hesitation. The film knows this. Its perspective progressively reduces the emotional distance between witnessing cruelty and wanting force used against those responsible for it. That movement is not morally neutral. It is one of the central ways the movie positions us. Our judgment changes because our access changes. We see enough vulnerability to understand why inaction feels unacceptable. We see enough brutality to understand why gentle intervention appears insufficient. We spend enough time with Rambo's competence to believe he can alter the balance. The film therefore creates a pathway from reluctance to permission. What it does not always create is much space beyond that pathway. the enemy remains comparatively externalized. Their actions establish moral boundaries, but their interiority is not explored with equivalent depth. This makes judgment easy, which is useful for momentum but limiting for complexity. The more one side is denied meaningful subjectivity, the easier it becomes for the film to frame retaliation as morally uncomplicated. That does not mean the movie needs to excuse abusive power. Moral complexity does not require pretending all positions are equally defensible. It means recognizing that a film can condemn clearly, while still examining how it constructs the viewer's desire for punishment. Rambo is more interested in the latter as sensation than as explicit reflection. Its intensity pushes the audience toward a state where the return of Rambo's full capability feels not merely expected but deserved. That is precisely why his earlier distance matters so much. The movie has spent substantial time teaching us that this man does not want to return to violence. When he finally moves decisively toward it, our judgment has been prepared by everything surrounding him. The film has changed the context until the quality that looked like a burden can be experienced as an answer. Whether that answer is morally satisfying depends on how much weight we give to necessity versus construction. Inside the story, Rambo increasingly appears necessary. From outside the story, we can see how deliberately the film has made him so. That tension is where its moral perspective is most revealing. By the time Rambo reaches its most dangerous territory, cinematic form has begun doing something that dialogue alone could never accomplish. The movie no longer needs characters to explain that the situation is unstable. Camera position, editing, sound, and spatial restriction make instability something the audience experiences directly. This is important because the film began with John Rambo as a relatively distant observer. The visual and sonic language gradually reduces that distance. As he moves closer to the conflict, the audience is also denied the comfort of detached observation. The camera frequently works at close physical range during moments of danger. Bodies, obstacles, vegetation, movement, and restricted sight lines interrupt clean spatial understanding. Instead of always giving us an elegant overview of where everyone stands, the film often makes the environment feel difficult to read. That limited access places us closer to the character's immediate awareness. We see enough to understand danger, but not always enough to feel comfortably ahead of it. For Rambo, this restriction has an additional effect. Because the audience already trusts his ability to read threatening environments, uncertainty in the image increases his authority. We may not have complete spatial knowledge, but we believe he is noticing information that matters. The form therefore reinforces an alignment established earlier through character. Our confidence does not come from seeing everything. It comes from being attached to someone who appears capable of functioning when visibility and certainty are limited. Editing plays a similar role. The quieter early passages allow Rambo's hesitation and emotional distance to register. Once the film moves more completely into rescue and confrontation, cuts become increasingly responsive to immediate threats, reactions, and changes in control. The result is not simply faster action. The editing changes who appears to possess knowledge from one moment to another. A character may believe a situation is stable only for the next visual piece of information to reveal that stability as temporary. The audience's understanding is repeatedly corrected through sequence rather than explanation. That is a perspective shift created by form. We do not merely hear that control is fragile. The film makes our own grasp of the situation fragile. Sound intensifies that effect. The environment is rarely treated as neutral background once danger becomes immediate. Movement, distant activity, sudden disruption, and bursts of violence compete for attention. Sound can alert us to something before the image completely explains it, creating the sensation that threat exists beyond the boundaries of what we currently see. That off-screen uncertainty matters in a film about limited control. Rambo is valuable partly because he behaves as though danger never begins, only when it enters the center of the frame. His attention appears broader than ordinary visual confirmation. The sound design helps the audience inhabit something resembling that alertness. We begin listening for changes rather than merely waiting to see them. The contrast between relative quiet and sudden intensity also shapes moral perception. When calm is unstable, the possibility of violence remains present even during pauses. The audience is therefore less likely to experience peaceful moments as true security. This supports Rambo's worldview without requiring him to repeat it. The world sounds temporary. Safety feels conditional. The film's visual treatment of Rambo himself changes as his participation increases. Early on, his physical presence can feel withheld, heavy, almost deliberately inactive. Later, the same body becomes an organizing force inside the flame. The transformation is not achieved by turning him into a different-looking person. It comes from changing the function of his presence. Stillness that once signaled withdrawal begins to signal preparation. Movement that once seemed reluctant becomes decisive. Framing helps reclassify the character without requiring a psychological monologue. The production environments contribute to this shift as well. Rivers, jungle spaces, villages, and enclosed routes are not merely scenic settings. They continually affect access. They determine what characters can see, where they can move, and how exposed or protected they feel. Space becomes part of the information structure. A wide environment does not necessarily create freedom. A narrow path does not necessarily create certainty. The film repeatedly makes location a problem that must be interpreted. This is particularly useful for Rambo because his relationship with space communicates expertise. He does not merely occupy environments, he evaluates them. When the movie emphasizes boundaries, concealment, distance, and exposure, it gives his observational skill something concrete to work against. Yet the film's formal aggression also creates one of its limitations. As violence becomes more intense, the sensory force can overpower the reflective distance established earlier. The audience may move from evaluating Rambo's return to simply experiencing the effectiveness of it. That shift is not accidental. Action cinema depends partly on converting thought into momentum. But in Rambo, the transformation has consequences for the perspective thesis. The film began by making us consider why John wanted distance from violence. Its later form makes distance increasingly difficult for the audience to maintain. Editing accelerates reaction. Sound reduces calm. Restricted visibility produces vulnerability. Physical impact pushes judgment toward immediacy. The result is that the audience can be carried toward Rambo's methods before having much time to reconsider their meaning. This is where form becomes argument. The movie does not simply tell us that certain circumstances leave few comfortable options. It creates a sensory environment in which hesitation feels increasingly dangerous and decisive action increasingly necessary. Our access has changed. We are closer to threat, closer to Rambo's competence, and farther from the detached position from which his worldview could be evaluated comfortably. That movement prepares the film for its decisive reframe. Because once the ending arrives, the question will no longer be whether John Rambo can return to violence. The film will have already answered that. The more revealing question is what his return finally tells us about the identity he believed he had left behind. Once Rambo allows full spoilers into the analysis, the central perspective becomes much easier to define. The film does not finally reveal that John Rambo misunderstood the world. In several important ways, it does the opposite. The violence he anticipated is real. The aid worker's vulnerability becomes undeniable, and the rescue eventually requires exactly the kind of capability he had tried to remove from his life. The deeper reframe comes from what the film does with that confirmation. Being correct about the world's brutality does not leave Rambo where he began. It forces him to decide whether understanding brutality gives him permission to withdraw from it or a responsibility to confront it. That distinction changes the meaning of his entire journey. At the beginning, Rambo's separation from conflict looks almost like a conclusion. He has withdrawn geographically, socially, and emotionally. He does not appear to be waiting for another cause. His life suggests that he has already answered the question of what his abilities are worth. He knows what he can do, knows what violence costs, and has apparently chosen distance. The missionaries disrupt that conclusion because they represent people whose response to suffering is almost the reverse of his own. They see knowledge of suffering as a reason to approach it. Rambo sees knowledge of danger as a reason to stay away. The kidnapping destroys the comfortable distinction between those positions. Once the missionaries are prisoners, Rambo's earlier warnings are vindicated. But vindication no longer gives him peace. The film has transformed his knowledge from justification for refusal into evidence of responsibility. He cannot say that he did not understand the risk. He understood it better than almost anyone. That is the first major retrospective change. His early pessimism initially looked like the final product of experience. By the end, it looks incomplete. Rambo understood what the world could do to people. What he had not resolved was what someone with his particular abilities should do when confronted with that knowledge again. The rescue mission makes this visible by surrounding him with mercenaries. They prevent the film from constructing a simple contrast between peaceful civilians and one uniquely capable warrior. These are armed professionals. They have experience, structure, and confidence of their own. Yet Rambo still occupies a different position. The mercenaries can execute a mission. Rambo understands the environment as though danger has become part of his perception. That difference becomes increasingly important as plans fail to contain reality. The film keeps shifting authority away from declared leadership and toward demonstrated awareness. Rambo does not need an official command to become central. Circumstances make his knowledge harder and harder to ignore. The moment he fully commits, therefore, reframes his earlier silence. It was easy to interpret that silence simply as emotional emptiness. The later film revealed something more specific. Rambo has spent much of the opening containing a part of himself that remains completely functional. His capacity never disappeared. His willingness to use it did. That separation is essential to understanding the character. When Rambo begins acting decisively, the movie is not showing a man rediscovering forgotten skills. It is showing a man removing a barrier he deliberately placed between those skills and the rest of his life. This makes his transformation less triumphant than it might initially appear. There is satisfaction in watching his competence become decisive, and the film clearly understands the expectations surrounding this character. But that satisfaction sits beside another interpretation. Rambo's extraordinary effectiveness also demonstrates just how little distance truly existed between the isolated man in Thailand and the soldier he believed he had left behind. The identity was never gone. It was waiting behind refusal. That becomes particularly important during the rescue itself. Rambo's actions help Sarah and the other surviving captives escape, and his practical understanding becomes indispensable as the situation collapses around them. The film has now reversed the relationship established near the beginning. Sarah once needed Rambo to help her reach people she believed deserved assistance. Now Rambo has entered danger partly because Sarah and the others need someone capable of bringing them back. Yet this is not merely a reversal of who saves whom. Sarah's earlier position has changed. Rambo's moral position. She represented the idea that another person's suffering can create an obligation even when intervention is dangerous. Rambo initially rejected the logic behind that choice. By joining the rescue, he effectively accepts a harsher version of the same principle. He still does not become an idealist. He does not suddenly adopt Sarah's worldview. But his behavior begins acknowledging what his opening philosophy could not. Distance is also a decision. And sometimes distance has consequences that cannot be dismissed simply because intervention is risky. This is where the perspective axis begins resolving itself. The withdrawn outsider and the hardened participant were never two completely separate versions of Rambo. They are competing answers inside the same man. The outsider knows the cost. The participant knows that cost does not always eliminate obligation. The final combat makes the second position dominant. By the time the captives and rescuers are threatened with destruction, Rambo has removed nearly every layer that allowed its protagonist to remain morally or physically detached. The film's oppressive forces possess overwhelming control, and Rambo's intervention changes the balance. His violence becomes extreme because the film has constructed the situation around extreme power. This is where viewers may experience the movie's most forceful emotional release. For much of the film, violence has belonged primarily to people using power against the vulnerable. The final confrontation redirects physical power against those who have been exercising it. That reversal is central to the film's moral engineering. The audience has spent enough time witnessing helplessness that Rambo's overwhelming effectiveness can feel like restoration rather than simply escalation. But the perspective analysis becomes more useful when we resist stopping at that feeling. The movie has carefully prepared us to want Rambo unleashed. That desire is itself part of the film's design. Earlier sections positioned his capacity for violence as something troubling enough that he had withdrawn from the world. Later sections progressively remove alternatives until the same capacity feels indispensable. The film therefore changes our judgment without significantly changing Rambo's ability. What changes is context. This is the full reframe. The weapon was never the mystery. The moral situation surrounding the weapon was. The final battle also reveals the limitation discussed earlier. Because the opposing military force is given relatively little interior complexity, the audience is rarely encouraged to hesitate over the direction of its judgment. The moral imbalance is intentionally severe. Civilians and captives have been placed in positions of vulnerability, while those exercising violent authority have largely been defined through cruelty and domination. That clarity gives the climax extraordinary momentum. It also means the film does not deeply interrogate Rambo's methods while they are producing results. Once he is fully activated, the movie's sensory and moral structures work together. Editing, sound, physical intensity, and the imbalance of power all push in the same direction. The audience is no longer standing at the emotional distance from which Rambo's worldview was initially examined. We are inside the release of that worldview. That is why the climax simultaneously completes the film's argument and exposes its narrowness. Rambo believed that the world could become so brutal that violence would answer violence more effectively than idealism could. The movie eventually gives him a situation designed to prove that belief. Yet the ending does something unexpected after that confirmation. It does not leave him in the conflict. That matters enormously. If the film ended with Rambo simply disappearing back into the jungle, the conclusion would imply that his true identity existed only in violence. His journey would have taken him from isolation to combat and then returned him to isolation, confirming that nothing beyond survival had really changed. Instead, after the rescue and the final confrontation, John Rambo makes another movement. He goes home. The final images of his return to the United States quietly reframe almost everything that preceded them. After spending the film moving deeper into a world that seemed to confirm his pessimism, he does not respond by withdrawing even further. He moves toward a place associated with personal origin and belonging. This is not presented as a complete psychological cure. The film has done too little interior explanation to justify such a neat conclusion. Rambo does not suddenly become emotionally transparent. We are not shown that trauma has disappeared or that violence has somehow repaired him. The significance lies in direction. At the beginning, his direction was away from conflict, away from national identity, away from intimate social connection, and implicitly away from a previous self. At the end, he walks toward home. That physical movement is more expressive than a lengthy declaration would have been. It suggests that confronting violence did not merely reactivate the soldier. It also interrupted the assumption that exile was the only life remaining to him. This changes how Sarah's influence can be understood. Her importance is not that she reforms Rambo through sentimentality. The film never turns their connection into a conventional romantic solution. Instead, she represents a human claim upon someone who has organized his life around avoiding claims. Her presence asks him to care before the story asks him to fight. That order matters. Without the first movement, the second would be merely mechanical. Rambo already knew how to fight. What changes is why he chooses to become involved. The rescue therefore does not prove that violence gives his life meaning. A more convincing interpretation is that responsibility gives his abilities a temporary purpose, and acting on that responsibility reminds him that complete withdrawal is not the only possible response to his past. That is a much more complicated ending. The world has not improved enough to disprove his pessimism. Rambo himself has changed enough to stop allowing pessimism to determine every direction he takes. The perspective axis now reaches its resolution. The film began by placing us beside a withdrawn outsider who treats experience as evidence that involvement is futile or dangerous. It then drags that perspective through circumstances where detachment becomes increasingly difficult to separate from abandonment. By the climax, Rambo has become the hardened participant again, but the final reframe prevents participation from being the endpoint. The real destination is reintegration, not complete reintegration into society, not a claim that he has become an ordinary man, and certainly not proof that his past has been erased. It is simply the first movement toward a life defined by something other than running from what he knows he is capable of, that makes the film's opening look different in retrospect. His isolation initially resembled independence. The ending makes it look more like suspension. His silence initially resembled certainty. The ending reveals that certainty did not contain a complete answer. His refusal initially looked like evidence that he understood himself. The ending suggests that he understood his capacity for violence far better than he understood what life might remain beyond it. Even the film's title acquires a slightly different weight through that moment. This is not a story primarily about transforming John Rambo into someone new. It strips away distance until he is forced to confront the continuity between who he was and who he still is. He cannot simply erase the soldier, but he may be able to decide where that soldier goes when the fighting stops. That is why the quiet journey home is more important to the perspective argument than the scale of the final battle. The battle confirms what Rambo can do. Going home changes what that ability means. It takes the man who began the movie believing distance was clarity and leaves him moving toward connection without pretending that the darkness behind him has disappeared. The final perspective is therefore neither the optimism of the missionaries nor the complete cynicism of the isolated warrior. It is an uneasy position between them. The world can be every bit as violent as Rambo believes. Good intentions can fail. Force can sometimes become necessary within the extreme conditions the movie constructs. But none of those truths automatically prove that permanent withdrawal is wisdom. Rambo's deepest shift is not from peaceful man to warrior. It is from someone who uses knowledge of suffering as a reason to remain outside the world, to someone who finally allows that knowledge to pull him back toward it. The action resolves the immediate conflict. The walk home resolves the perspective. Sylvester Stallone's performance is the main reason Rambo can keep John Rambo emotionally distant without making him dramatically empty. The character speaks comparatively little, explains himself reluctantly, and often refuses the kind of expressive behavior that would normally tell an audience exactly what to feel. Stallone compensates by making small physical decisions carry unusual weight. The result is a performance built less around revelation than around controlled access. Rambo's face is rarely neutral, even when it appears motionless. His reactions often suggest that he has already evaluated a situation before the people around him have finished explaining it. He listens with a kind of guarded impatience, as though experience has taught him to distrust the distance between what people intend and what circumstances will permit. That quality establishes authority without friendliness. The audience does not become close to Rambo because he invites identification. We become close because the film repeatedly proves that his attention matters. This is a significant difference. A conventional heroic performance might emphasize confidence through speeches, humor, or visible charisma. Stallone largely removes those tools. Rambo's authority comes from the economy of his behavior. He rarely needs to advertise competence because the performance treats competence as something already internalized. His posture contributes to that impression. In quieter passages, Rambo can appear heavy rather than relaxed. His stillness has tension inside it. He does not seem temporarily inactive so much as deliberately contained. That distinction supports the entire perspective argument because the audience is encouraged to understand that the warrior identity has not vanished. It is being held back. Once Rambo enters the rescue mission more fully, Stallone does not create a dramatic personality transformation. The character does not suddenly become talkative, energetic, or emotionally liberated. Instead, the performance changes through purpose. His attention becomes directional, his movement becomes more decisive. The same physical reserve that earlier communicated disengagement begins communicating concentration. That continuity is essential because it makes the transition believable. If Stallone performed a later Rambo as an entirely different man, the film would suggest that combat restores a lost identity. Instead, the performance implies that the identity was always present beneath the withdrawal. The change is not rediscovery, it is permission. Julie Benz, playing Sarah Miller, provides an important counterweight because a performance approaches interaction from a different emotional register. Sarah communicates belief through openness. She attempts persuasion because she still assumes that another person can be reached through explanation, empathy, and moral appeal. Placed opposite Rambo's guarded behavior, that openness becomes more significant than the amount of dialogue exchanged between them. Sarah's presence gives the audience a way of looking at Rambo that is not based entirely on fear, utility, or combat ability. She treats his resistance as something worth engaging rather than simply an obstacle to bypass. That changes our alignment with him. When a closed character is surrounded only by people who distrust or need him, reserve can easily become a badge of superiority. Sarah prevents that interpretation from becoming complete. Her willingness to keep addressing the person beneath the defensive posture suggests that Rambo's isolation is not necessarily wisdom, simply because it is understandable. Stallone responds with minimal changes, which makes those exchanges more effective. Rambo does not suddenly offer complete emotional access. Instead, attention itself becomes expressive. Who he listens to matters. When he allows another person's words to remain with him, the performance creates movement without requiring a confession. That approach continues around the mercenary team, where performance controls alignment in another way. The group initially evaluates Rambo from the outside. His age, silence, outsider status, and lack of formal position create room for underestimation. The audience, however, has already spent much more time observing him. This produces dramatic privilege. We know that the mercenaries are reading incomplete evidence. Stallone does not have to answer skepticism with exaggerated dominance because our existing alignment does the work for him. The calmer he remains, the larger the gap can feel between how others perceive him and what the audience expects him to be capable of. This is one of the film's simplest but most effective uses of performance. Rambo gains authority partly by refusing to perform authority socially. When he later demonstrates practical value, the audience experiences confirmation rather than surprise. But Stallone's performance also prevents that confirmation from becoming entirely celebratory. There's very little visible joy in Rambo's return to violence. His efficiency can be overwhelming, but the character rarely appears emotionally rejuvenated by it. That matters enormously. If Rambo looked exhilarated by becoming lethal again, the film's ending would suggest that violence restored his authentic self. Instead, the performance leaves room for a more difficult interpretation. This may be the environment where his abilities function most completely without being the environment where he should remain. That difference becomes especially important after the final confrontation. The quieter closing movement requires Stallone to shift perspective once more. The external intensity disappears. There is no need to prove capability. Rambo's body no longer has to organize itself around immediate danger. What remains is a man moving toward home, because the performance has withheld emotional explanation throughout the film. That movement carries more weight than a speech about reconciliation would have carried. Rambo does not need to announce that something has changed. The audience has spent the movie learning to read change through behavior. Direction becomes expression. The man who began by keeping the world away now chooses to move towards something connected to his past and identity. That does not suddenly make him transparent. And it should not. The consistency of Stallone's performance is precisely what protects the ending from becoming sentimental. Rambo remains recognizably guarded. The film simply allows his guardedness to point somewhere different. Performance therefore controls our alignment with John Rambo by giving us less emotional access than we might expect while making every small change in that access meaningful. We never completely enter his interior life. We observe its boundaries. And because those boundaries shift only slightly, the final movement feels significant. The performance does not ask us to believe that Rambo has become another person. It asks us to recognize that the same person has finally chosen another direction. The image and sound design of Rambo repeatedly place the audience in a world where complete access is impossible. Even when the geography seems straightforward, the film rarely allows the environment to feel fully controlled. Rivers, jungle, darkness, structures, movement, and off-screen activity continually limit what characters can see. That limitation is central to the movie's perspective. because John Rambo is defined partly by his ability to function when other people do not possess a complete picture. The landscape is therefore more than background. It controls information. Early in the film, the river creates a useful example. Travel appears to offer a clear route from one place to another, yet the surrounding environment remains difficult to read. Water may provide movement, but it does not provide security. The characters can continue forward while remaining exposed to threats they cannot fully anticipate. Rambo responds to space differently from the people around him. Others often experience a location according to what they want to accomplish there. He evaluates what the location permits. That difference becomes visible without requiring technical explanation. The camera can show several people occupying the same environment while their reactions tell us that they are not seeing the same thing. For the missionaries, a route may represent access to people who need help. For Rambo, the same route carries information about vulnerability. The film uses framing to make that disagreement physical. Rambo is frequently positioned as someone observing before acting. His attention appears to extend beyond the immediate subject of a conversation. Even when another character occupies the dramatic center, his reactions can suggest awareness of the surrounding space. This reinforces the audience's trust in him. We begin to assume that what exists near the edge of his attention matters. The jungle intensifies this relationship between visibility and knowledge. Dense surroundings reduce long, comfortable lines of sight. The environment can hide people, interrupt movement, or make the source of a threat uncertain. For the audience, restricted visibility produces dependence. We cannot always independently confirm everything Rambo appears to understand. Instead, the film asks us to trust his alertness. That creates an unusual hierarchy of access. Rambo does not necessarily receive more information because the movie shows him secret material unavailable to everyone else. He receives more authority because he interprets incomplete information more effectively. Sound strengthens that distinction. Danger in Rambo often feels larger than what the frame currently contains. Activity outside the image, distant movement, voices, sudden disruption, and changes in ambient noise can make the surrounding world feel active even when the camera does not reveal every source. The audience is therefore encouraged to listen beyond the visible frame. This approximates Rambo's own state of attention. He does not behave as though danger begins only when it can be clearly seen. Sound allows the movie to establish presence before complete visual confirmation. That makes the environment feel less controllable and increases the significance of characters who can react without needing perfect certainty. Silence also matters. Quiet in this film rarely guarantees safety. Because the audience has been conditioned to expect abrupt changes in control, a quieter passage can increase attention rather than reduce it. The absence of immediate disturbance creates room for anticipation. This is especially useful around Rambo. His stillness and the environment's relative quiet can work together. Both seem contained, yet neither feels empty. We are aware that action remains possible beneath the surface. When violence begins, the sonic environment changes dramatically. The film does not maintain the emotional distance of its quieter passages. Noise becomes dense, forceful, and difficult to ignore. Sound closes the gap between observation and physical consequence. That change affects judgment. Earlier, the audience could consider Rambo's relationship with violence from a comparatively reflective position. Later, the film makes violence immediate. The sensory intensity reduces the emotional space in which we might calmly evaluate every decision. We are pushed closer to reaction. Editing and sound therefore cooperate to produce access of a different kind. We may understand less spatially in a given instant, yet feel more directly involved. That is an important distinction. More information does not always create greater immersion. Sometimes restricted information creates stronger alignment because the audience must experience uncertainty alongside the characters. The climax takes this principle to its furthest point. By then, the film has built a large moral and physical imbalance. The visual structure increasingly directs attention toward vulnerability, threat, and Rambo's ability to alter the balance. His effectiveness becomes something the image organizes around. Where he once appeared almost separated from the surrounding world, he now changes the meaning of space simply by entering it. Locations become opportunities for intervention because the audience understands what his presence can do. Yet the film's most revealing visual movement comes afterward. The intensity recedes. The environment changes. Rambo is no longer being defined to contested terrain or immediate physical danger. The final movement toward home gives space a completely different function. For most of the film, locations test survival. At the end, location becomes identity. The road and rural surroundings do not threaten him in the way earlier spaces did. They lead somewhere. The visual emphasis shifts from reading danger to recognizing destination. That transition quietly alters the audience's access to Rambo. We still do not receive a long explanation of what he feels. Instead, the image gives us direction. The man who spent much of the film evaluating whether he should enter other people's conflicts is now moving toward a place connected to his own history. Sound no longer needs to overwhelm the moment. The absence of the earlier sensory aggression becomes meaningful because the film finally allows Rambo to occupy space without immediately preparing to dominate or survive it. Image and sound have therefore followed the same movement as the character. At first, they make us aware of distance. Then they narrow access until danger feels immediate. Finally, they restore enough quiet and openness for movement itself to become expressive. The film does not explain John Rambo's final state to us. It changes what we can see and hear around him, and after a story built on environments that constantly warn him to remain alert, the possibility of simply walking toward home becomes one of the clearest changes in perspective the movie can offer. The perspective of Rambo is strongest when John's experience gives the audience information without automatically making him morally correct. It becomes weaker when the film stops testing his worldview and begins arranging almost every element around confirming it. That limitation becomes increasingly visible in the second half. The opening establishes a genuine disagreement. Rambo believes that entering a violent situation with good intentions will not protect anyone from its consequences. Sarah and the missionaries believe that danger does not cancel responsibility. Those positions initially create productive tension because neither can simply erase the other. Once the mission collapses, however, the balance changes. Rambo's warnings are confirmed so completely that the alternative perspective begins losing complexity. The aid worker's vulnerability validates his understanding of danger, while the rescue mission progressively demonstrates the usefulness of his methods. The problem is not that Rambo was right about the danger. The problem is that the film gives increasingly little resistance to the idea that his understanding of violence is also the most complete understanding of reality. That makes some supporting characters feel less like independent viewpoints and more like devices for revealing how capable Rambo is. The mercenary team suffers from this most obviously. Their presence should complicate the film's hierarchy of expertise. They are trained professionals with their own experience and authority. Yet, the narrative repeatedly needs Rambo to emerge as the person whose judgment matters most. That can be satisfying dramatically, but it also makes the perspective predictable. Once we understand the pattern, disagreement with Rambo becomes less interesting because we expect circumstances to validate him. A similar simplification affects the antagonistic forces. The movie communicates their brutality with unmistakable clarity, but it offers little interior access that might explain how power operates beyond immediate cruelty. This does not mean the film needs to create moral equivalence or sympathy for abusive authority. It means that almost all complexity remains concentrated around Rambo. The more externalized the opposition becomes, the easier the audience's moral position becomes. That helps the action. It limits the analysis. The film also pushes its violent intensity so far that the sensory experience can overwhelm the more complicated perspective established earlier. The opening invites us to consider what returning to violence means for a man who has tried to separate himself from it. During the climax, that question becomes less visible. The immediate effectiveness of Rambo's actions dominates attention. The audience is encouraged to experience release before reflection. That is not necessarily a failure of action filmmaking. The climax is designed to produce momentum and emotional reversal, but it weakens the earlier ambiguity surrounding Rambo's identity. For a significant stretch, the film risks making the answer too simple. The world is brutal. Rambo understands brutality. Therefore, Rambo is what this world requires. The ending fortunately complicates that conclusion. His return home prevents the film from leaving him entirely inside the role that the climax restores. That final movement suggests that combat was not the destination, even if the movie spends much of its energy making combat the most dramatically rewarding part of the journey. Still, the transition could have carried greater emotional depth if the film had preserved more of the uncertainty around Rambo during the rescue itself. We see what he does. We understand why he becomes necessary. We receive less access to what that renewed violence costs him internally. Stallone's restraint helps preserve ambiguity, but restraint can only supply so much material when the screenplay increasingly prioritizes action over interior consequence. That limitation fits a film I would place at 6.4 out of 10, rather than one whose perspective fully matches the force of its execution. That is a compelling idea beneath Rambo. Experience can teach a person to see danger accurately while still teaching the wrong lesson about whether disengagement is the only way to survive it. The movie reaches that idea. It does not explore every implication of it. Its perspective breaks whenever Rambo's knowledge becomes so dominant that competing ways of seeing stop being genuinely competitive. Yet, the film recovers something important by refusing to let violence become his final location. The climax proves that the warrior still exists. The ending reminds us that proving it was never enough, and that distinction prevents the film's narrowest perspective from becoming its last one. What remains after Rambo finishes is not the image of a man discovering that violence is his true purpose. The film leaves something more complicated behind. John Rambo has spent most of the story moving between two positions: the belief that experience justifies withdrawal and the recognition that experience can also create responsibility. The final perspective makes his isolation look different from how it appeared at the beginning. At first, distance seemed to be Rambo's clearest judgment about the world. He had seen enough violence to distrust idealism, institutions, and the possibility that intervention could produce anything except another cycle of suffering. His withdrawal therefore carried the appearance of hard-earned wisdom. By the end, that wisdom has not been disproved. It has been exposed as incomplete. The world remains capable of exactly the brutality Rambo expected. The missionaries' good intentions do not magically protect them. Professional confidence does not guarantee control. Rambo's knowledge of violence repeatedly proves useful, yet none of that ultimately persuades him to remain detached. That is the distinction that gives the film its strongest final meaning. Rambo does not return home because the world has shown him that his pessimism was mistaken. He returns after seeing some of its darkest assumptions confirmed. The change therefore has to come from his relationship with those assumptions, rather than from external reassurance. He can recognize violence without allowing it to define the boundaries of his entire life. He can acknowledge what he is capable of without treating that capability as the only identity available to him. The final movement toward home gives character, form, and perspective a surprisingly quiet point of convergence. Earlier environments demanded constant assessment. Space represented exposure, danger, or escape. At the end, movement through space carries another meaning: destination. Rambo is finally traveling towards something rather than merely away from something. That does not transform Rambo into a psychologically exhaustive character study. The movie remains much more comfortable expressing change through action and physical direction than through sustained interior exploration. Supporting viewpoints sometimes lose complexity once the narrative begins validating Rambo's instincts, and the intensity of the climax can overpower the ambiguity established earlier. Those limitations keep my rating at 6.4 out of 10. But the film has a perspective worth separating from the sheer force of its action. Its most interesting idea is not that Rambo was correct to distrust the world. It is that correctness did not give him a complete way to live within it. Viewers who value direct, uncompromising action may naturally respond to the film's physical intensity. But there is also something here for viewers interested in the character beneath that intensity. A man whose greatest shift is not learning how to fight again, but reconsidering what remains after fighting is finished. The withdrawn outsider and the hardened participant finally stop functioning as opposites. They become parts of the same identity. Rambo knows what violence costs because he has lived inside it. He also knows by the end that avoiding every connection capable of leading him back toward pain is another kind of surrender. The movie does not resolve that contradiction completely. Its final image to something more appropriate. It gives Rambo a direction, and after a story spent asking whether he belongs inside conflict or outside it. The perspective that remains is the possibility that belonging may exist somewhere else entirely. Rambo ultimately leaves John Rambo with a different relationship to the truth he carried from the beginning. He was never wrong to recognize how violent the world could become. What changes is his belief that seeing that violence clearly requires him to remain permanently outside everything that might pull him back toward other people. The film's most meaningful shift is therefore quieter than its largest action sequence. Rambo proves that the warrior is still there. But the final movement toward home suggests that being a warrior does not have to be the entire definition of the man. That leaves an interesting question behind. Do you read Rambo's return home as evidence that he has finally begun reconnecting with a life beyond conflict? Or does the film leave too much of his internal change unexplored for that conclusion to feel complete? Let me know how you interpret that ending. If you enjoyed looking at Rambo through the way it controls distance, knowledge, judgment, and audience alignment, subscribe to Film Perspective Media for more movie analysis from this point of view. Thanks for watching and for taking one last look at John Rambo, not simply as the man who returns to the fight, but as the man who finally chooses somewhere to go when the fighting is over.